Time. So, okay, well, let's get started. It's 1:30. And so I'd like to welcome everybody to the Disaster Lifecycle Cluster session here at ESIP during the winter meeting. It's called Cross-Domain Collaboratory. Let's look at wildfires. I'm Dave Jones, the CEO of Storm Center Communications and co-chair of the Disaster Lifecycle Cluster, along with Karen Moe, who is joining us here as well. And I also want to thank our ESIP fellow, Shan Huang, who is a graduate student hoping to finish up her PhD degree in the next this year sometime. Fingers crossed, right, Shan? And really happy to have her as part of the ESIP fellow program. It's her second year. She's just done a terrific job. I'd like to go through just a quick welcome and a couple of slides here, and then have Karen come in and tell you a little bit more about the session as well. But please mute yourself when you're not talking. I'm sure that you're well aware of all this now, having done this for 2 years. And if you're asking a question verbally, please turn on your camera so we can see you. We love to see smiling faces on the other end of ESIP cameras. And please put in the Google Doc your name, your location, pronouns, whatever you'd like, along with your email address, so we can follow up with you, because this is part of the Disaster Lifecycle Cluster, and we would love to keep you engaged on some of the things that we're working on. And this meeting is really going to set the stage for the next year as we roll out looking at wildfires. And Dave,
also, yes, Dave, just to comment that in our Google Docs, there will be space for people to contribute any comments that they have with our invited speakers. And when we get into our breakout sessions, there will be anybody can contribute notes at those points.
That's great, Karen. Thanks so much. And the breakout sessions that we do have, please participate in them, even if you feel like you don't have anything to contribute. You probably do. And these will be probably around 15 minutes long when we just dive into some of the challenges and things like that. So we appreciate you coming. I just want to set the context for the meeting here. And here's the agenda that we're going to be following today. So after we get through with the welcomes and introductory remarks, we're going to introduce you to Carol Akarius, who is the CEO of a nonprofit called Coalitions and Collaboratives. She's going to talk about the challenges of being ready for the wildfire. I'll let Carol talk to you about what Coalitions and Collaboratives does, but they connect with communities and they really help them obtain grant funding and things like that, so they can help to make their communities more resilient. And this is exactly how we want to proceed within the Disaster Lifecycle Cluster as we look to provide more earth science data sets and information into communities and neighborhoods and homeowners associations, so people can have a situational awareness about what's going on around their community with regard to wildfires. And then it could extend out into other hazards as well. After Carol speaks, we're going to talk, have the ESIP clusters talk. We have 5 of them that will present today: ag and cluster, air quality, Enviro sensing, data readiness, and information quality clusters. Will give us 2 to 3 slides each for about 4 minutes each on what those clusters are doing that could be applied into the wildfire topic area. So we're really looking to leverage a lot of the talent and capability that resides within ESIP, and everybody's doing their own things within clusters, but we're having a real push now to see how we can cross-fertilize these clusters, make sure we're not duplicating things that people are doing, but more importantly, we take advantage of the high talent level in those clusters and apply it to some of our use cases. And then we're going to have a breakout, a 20-minute, 15 to 20-minute breakout session. And you see the topics there. I won't mention them again, but just choose which one you would like to participate in. And you can choose your own cluster. We're not going to have a random dropping. You can choose the clusters that you go into. And then when we come out of that, we'll have notes. And I'd like to have a member of each one of the cluster, each one of the breakouts, talk a little bit about what you talked about, some of your top challenges or things that you identified. And then we're going to go into a presentation from David Green. Dr. David Green is here with us. He's with NASA's Applied Sciences program. David has been the program manager for the disasters program within Applied Sciences and has now taken on the task of wildfires. NASA recently launched the Wildfires program, and NASA is having a big push to share their innovations, share their technologies, and really dive into areas where they can contribute to the wildfire problem. So we have an awesome agency that's saying, hey, we're in. We have a lot that can go towards this problem. And David's going to tell us about that and engage us in some conversations. One of the big things that I'd like everybody to think about is how can ESIP and the Disaster Lifecycle Cluster and others help empower NASA to be more successful as they move forward with the wildfire program? How can we take our talents and technologies and innovation capability and really say, hey, NASA, we think we can help you accelerate your successes that you're looking to identify, because the wildfire problem isn't going away, it's getting worse. We don't have wildfire seasons anymore, we have the wildfire year, and it continues. So then we'll have the meeting wrap up and some takeaways. So Karen, I'd like to turn it over to you, see if there's anything that you would like to add to it, and then I'll introduce Carol.
My apologies. I was having a little trouble getting back on. I would really just like to emphasize the idea that we will be using today's session to clarify our plans going forward. And we've really designed this to be part of 3 major meetings in Ecip. So moving through the full disaster life cycle. So I'm pretty excited about the possibilities we'll have to leverage today's session, especially since we've been hearing some really good talks throughout the Ecip meeting. So we're on a good roll. Thanks.
Dave, we can't hear you. Dave.
Sorry, I was just saying that my iPad was sitting on my keyboard and it started to do its own thing. So apologies there. I just wanted to, and we're going to dive into that, what Karen was saying here in just a second. I have a couple of slides that I just wanted to show. This first one, we showed this slide last meeting during the summer meeting, and I think it's really important. It's a quote from Michael Mann, who's the author of the new Climate War. He says, credibility and integrity. We talk a lot about trusted data and trusted information and providing that to decision makers within the disaster lifecycle cluster and external to the disaster lifecycle cluster as well. The credibility and integrity are a scientist's bread and butter and greatest asset. It's the currency that allows scientists to serve as trusted communicators to the public. So I just want to emphasize the underlying theme of the disaster lifecycle cluster and the ESIP Federation is that we work very hard to identify trusted information sources, produce trusted data, so that can be used to drive decision making, and in some cases in 30 seconds. We work with the All Hazards Consortium. We've talked about them a lot in the past, where they use data feeds, and those data feeds go to people who are not trained in science. They're decision makers. How many trucks should I put over there? How many, how many pieces of supplies or cases of water do we need over here? They need to look at data and they need to be able to make rapid decisions. So within the ESIP disaster lifecycle cluster, we have this thing called the ESIP ecosystem of innovation. We've talked about this in the past before, where we have various clusters. Here's ag and climate, air quality. These are the clusters that are presenting today, along with any other ESIP cluster, can bring a technology, they can bring an approach, they can bring something new into this ecosystem of innovation. And we have the ability to connect to different users of data through real-time dashboards into these organizations, All Hazards, NOAA, the state of Florida, the Forest Service, and others. And so what we can do here is engage people in looking at these science products and give us feedback. So we're creating this ecosystem of innovation so we can rapidly test products, and then we can put them in front of decision makers. And that's really what we're about. And we're focusing on the wildfire problem challenge over the next year. And so I want to remind everybody that we are going to have some Slido questions that will pop up. And so this will get you to those questions, whether you scan this link with your phone or you go to the chat. There'll be a link to the Slido poll here. So before we go any further, these are 3 questions. We have a couple others through the session that we want to ask, but these are 3 that we'd love for you to answer. Number 1, where do you get wildfire information? Where do you get it today? The second one, who comes to mind when you think about trusted wildfire information? Is there a single organization? Is there more than one? And how do you decide whether to trust wildfire information? It could be, how do you determine how you trust any information, but in this context, wildfire information. So, so we're going to go to those polls and then we'll see what those answers are, and then I'll cover this particular slide. So, Shan, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share the answer to the poll questions as they come up. And we'll just take a couple of minutes to get those answers from you. And I think we might need to just do one question at a time. Shan, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you go, once we have enough answers for the first question, we'll go to the second question.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Dave. So I'm going to share my screen to show the live poll for the first question. Where do you get a wildfire information? So this is the first question. We're going to wait for 1 more minute to get more answers.
Responses are great.
I already pasted the link in the chat, or you can access the Slido through Kiko chat.
That's great. 18 responses so far. We'll just wait for a couple of more. That's great. There's a real diversity of information, which could also be a challenge, right? We'll be talking about that.
Yeah. Right now we got 3 votes on NIFC and 3 votes on NASA firms.
Okay. Great. Okay. So why don't we go to the second poll question? And that question is, who comes to mind when you think about trusted wildfire information? So slightly different question than before, just who comes to mind?
We got
And we'll wait till we get
14
up to
votes.
to about 20 or 21 like we had before, just so we can have a good
Okay.
good
That's
sample.
16. We have 2 on incident managers, 2 on NOAA, and NASA teachers and students. Okay, we got
Great.
20.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. Now we'll go to the third poll
Third
question. And that question is, how do you decide whether to trust wildfire information? This can be longer than one word.
It's great. We have 15 inputs. Check multiple sources. Validation. We got 20 votes on this as well.
Great.
Mhm.
Okay, I think that's great. So we can thank you for that. This is really good information that we'll be using throughout the course of our time within the disaster lifecycle cluster, and we may come back and talk about this as well. So Shan, this is great. I'll share my screen back to just tell you and show you what the purpose is of our meeting here today. We're really going to discuss how trusted data can be used by communities. Ecip is not boots on the ground doing work within neighborhoods and communities and all that stuff currently. And it's something that we really want to partner with those organizations or step out into those communities and to get feedback on what kind of data sets could be used to help keep these communities informed about what's happening, to improve their resilience, their situational awareness for the wildfire risk. So we're going to talk about how can coordination and data sharing empower communities and accelerate situational awareness and personal decision-making. Are there steps that agencies could take to share their data more effectively and rapidly and reliably with the public? How can data providers most effectively engage with communities? And that's going to lead into our first speaker here in just a moment. And then wildfire topics. This meeting we're using to focus on the pre-wildfire situation. We're going to work on that and evolve it through the next several months. And in 6 months, we're going to talk about during the wildfire. What data sets are available during a wildfire that we can provide to communities and groups and organizations that they can rely on to understand what the threat is to their locations or perhaps their businesses. By the summer meeting, when we do while the wildfire is going on, we're going to be preparing for post-wildfire for the winter 2023 meeting. So post-wildfire recovery and mitigation, things like burn scars and debris flows and mud flows, flash floods, they all become serious realities when a wildfire is put out, and those burn scars last for years. So that's really very important. And Carol may touch upon that as well with some of the work that she's been doing. So they're the goals and the purpose of this particular session. So one final Slido question before we go, or I'm sorry, after Carol speaks. We just want you to think about this. We're not going to go to it yet. Is what data could help during the pre-fire stage. So start thinking about that. We're not going to do the poll exactly right now. We'll do it after a little bit, in just a little bit. After the ESIP cluster members present is when we'll ask this question, but just keep it in your mind. What kind of data would help during a pre-wildfire stage? So with that, I'd love to introduce to you our guest speaker today, invited speaker. And Carol Akarius is the CEO of Coalitions and Collaboratives. She's about 45 minutes west of Colorado Springs right now. And I met Carol in 2019 when we had a meeting. Coalitions and Collaboratives put on a meeting called After the Flames. I went out to it and participated in that day-long meeting, which was terrific. It even included a field trip in Colorado Springs, out to Colorado Springs to show a burn area and what Colorado Springs is doing to mitigate major floods, like putting up these huge fences to stop rock slides and debris flows and things like that. We even had some exercises on a real wildfire or a wildfire that was burning and how would we handle that. So Carol, I'd like to welcome you. Carol's not going to have any slides. She'll just talk to us and she'll talk to us about communities in preparation, the challenges of being ready for the wildfire. So Carol, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Great, and thank you, Dave, for inviting me. And I'm really excited to be here and to talk about this because I see tremendous opportunities for using the technology and tools that you folks help develop. And there's definitely room for us to figure out ways to make them more user-friendly for communities. There's definitely ways to think of how do we consolidate information more effectively. But first, I want to talk just for a minute about myself. I think, you know, when somebody gets invited, it's like, well, why this person? I started my career working in water and wastewater treatment. Then I went off on a crazy tangent. My husband and I went and farmed in Minnesota for about a decade, raised dairy cows and milked cows, did beef, pork, lamb. But Minnesota was not our spiritual home. We came back to Colorado. And just when we came back, a job was being advertised for a new place-based group called the Coalition for the Upper South Platte. Watershed-based group. The local counties, Denver Water, Aurora Water, state agencies had all come together, signed an MOU to start this group. And why did they start it? They started it because of a fire in 1996 called the Buffalo Creek Fire. Back in the day, Buffalo Creek was 11,700 acres, burned that in a 24-hour burn period. And at that point in time, it was by far the largest fire in modern Colorado history. So people thought it was an anomaly, but a lot of researchers with the Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station, a lot of foresters were saying, this is not an anomaly. This is the tip of a very big iceberg. And now we know that was the tip of a very big iceberg. So when CUSP formed, a couple of years later, we had a High Meadow Fire. Then a couple of years after that, we had the Hayman Fire. In 2002, coming in at 137,000 acres. Thankfully, it was in a fairly rural area, didn't burn a lot of houses, but it documented the idea that forest conditions had changed over the years and that forest suppression and climate change were starting to drive bigger and worse fires. And I'm not telling anybody anything new, you all know that. So one of the things we'd like to think about in this is how do we do pre-fire better? But I like that the topic is life cycle of fire and that the plan is for 2 more meetings on during fire and post-fire, because that's it. We have forest health issues that's leading to fire. We have issues during the fire and how we get information to communities, how we get information to local emergency managers, local elected officials, And then post-fire, we have how do we deal with post-fire flooding and wholesale changes to ecosystems. So I think, you know, the opportunity to look at the life cycle is something I'm really excited about. One of the things that Dave said during his information or his intro was the diversity of information. And I think when it comes to communities, and when I talk communities, it could be 2 or 3 landowners in a small area. It could be a bigger HOA. It could be a local government. It could be a local utility, which although kind of quasi-local government, they have their own world and issues they deal with. It could be a county. They're all, every one of them is a local kind of partner and collaborator and person dealing with these issues. So for them, a lot of times the biggest problem and challenge is the diversity of information. We get bombarded with so much every day that it's hard to track. And the question of, you know, how do we know what's trusted? Unfortunately, we know nowadays a lot of people get a lot of their information off of Facebook and Twitter and things that probably are not worthy of being trustworthy. Might be good information, might be total crap, but that's where they're getting information. The other thing that came up in the Slido question, somebody responded to the last question about the historic record. Well, one of the problems with basing things on the historic record is we don't have a world in which the historic record necessarily represents the future. We're now dealing with climate change, excuse me, at such a level that, you know, like I said, in 96, 11,700 acres was a giant fire. Now that's actually kind of a small fire again. We wish that that was a big fire. So we have to take into context that we need to understand the past, but we also need to understand that it does not always predict our future at all. So when I start talking about how do we ramp up wildfire mitigation and how do we use information from sources like yours to help get that information out to the public. One of the things I think that comes to me frequently is we need better vegetation analysis at this point in time. A lot of the mapping and tools that we have on vegetation doesn't necessarily provide us with the best up to the minute information on where insect and disease outbreaks have changed fire potential. We had in 2020 in Colorado, we had the East Troublesome fire that burned up and over the Continental Divide and the Cameron Peak fire adjacent on the other side. If you had looked at those areas in like the Colorado Forest Atlas, which is Colorado's tool for prioritizing potential fire areas, they weren't prioritized very high. Most of the troublesome fire was in Grand County. If you looked at Grand County, it was kind of a low risk in that mapping tool. So another idea I have is how do we make it clear that, you know, there's no low risk areas left in the West for wildfire. Everything's at risk. Is it this year? Is it 10 years from now? Is it 50 years from now? I'm starting to tell people, assume it's going to burn. Assume it's going to burn hot. When it burns hot, assume that there's going to be high intensity rainfall on it that's going to cause significant post-fire flooding. But a lot of times our maps and our tools that we translate data out to the public with, if the public in Grand County looked at that map, they'd go, oh, I don't have any problem. I live in an area that's, you know, green or yellow on the map. So I tell people it's shades of red. Running from, you know, dark red to purple to black. I mean, that's the colors we should be showing folks when we're trying to say this is risk. But moreover, I think we can use technical tools to go with the assumption that risk is everywhere. But what are the values we care about and how do we protect the values and how do we mitigate to protect those values. A lot of times that's cutting trees. That could also be improving riparian resiliency so that post-fire flooding and debris flows don't cause the same amount of damage. So thinking in terms of data, how do we get data pulled together more effectively? And then how do we articulate that data back out in a way that people understand they're at threat? Is their threat really, really, really high, or medium high, low high? But guess what? In the Western US at this point in time, it's all high. We had the grass fire in Boulder County, the Marshall Fire on New Year's Eve day, burned over 1,000 homes. Those folks would not have considered that they were in a wildland urban interface till that fire got started. One of my pet peeves lately is I'm starting to not like the concept of wildland urban interface at all. The reason is it suggests that there's some line of demarcation. The wildland's there, the community's here. Throughout most of the West, though, there's houses and all sprinkled throughout the forest areas. And then we have places like Superior and Louisville. They're surrounded by county open spaces that were grasslands. And those grasslands, we had a great rainy spring and early summer. That grass was 3 feet tall. Late summer through the fall and really still, the Front Range is in drought, pretty intense drought. And then we had 100-mile-an-hour wind. So when we get the right weather conditions, we get communities at risk. And so it's in my brain at this point in time, we know fuels are everywhere. How do we prioritize fuel treatments? It should be around values. And how do we get that data? That's where I think you all can help. The new flood factor website, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but I've been studying that recently in relation to fire scars and post-fire flooding. It's great information. Looking at the fire scars and the flooding I've seen, it's so much better than people look and say, well, I'm not in a flood zone. That map shows people that they're in a flood zone. And it's actually been really highly articulative in where flooding has happened after these fires, and homes that, if you looked at a FEMA flood map, no, they're not in a 100-year floodplain according to the FEMA flood maps, but by jings, they flood in these after fires. As for the educational components, so I don't know how many of you know who Sarah McCaffrey is. She's a social scientist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Sarah has done a whole boatload of work on, how do people learn and understand and perceive their threats? And unfortunately, what her message has shown is that for about 6 months after a big fire period, people in the area that fire occurred are pretty cognizant. But as 6 months to a year, they kind of drift off. And by a year and beyond, they're not thinking about fire and their risk. And within about 2 years, they get to the point of saying, oh, we already had our fire, we're okay. But if they already had their fire, their house was probably gone, or they're in an area of a completely changed ecosystem that is now a grass shrubland. But for most of these folks, they're still at that risk. So I think the communication portion is really, it's kind of constant reiteration and through different sources. For community managers, folks like myself who engage with local citizens, for local elected officials, if we have tools that we can show people, so on the post-fire flooding, I think flood factor, I think if we have tools that can show, density of fuels around their homes and subdivisions in a way that they can understand, that's going to help. That's going to help. Boulder County, a couple of years ago in the forested part of the county, sent out with tax bills like a bullseye around people's houses. And it was an image, they took it off Google Earth, the image of the roof of your house. They showed the 30-foot and the 100-foot perimeters for defensible space. I think that was a pretty effective tool. So things like that, if we had a website we could refer people to, stick your address in and see your home in relation to 30-foot and 100-foot perimeters for fire, that would be a good tool. A question, how have the social scientists been engaged to help figure out the issues? They continue to work. We work a lot with Sarah. She does a lot of research. I don't know that she has an answer either, though on the best approach. It's kind of constant reiteration from trusted sources, and it is more one-on-one. So what I tell our staff for CUSP and the other watershed groups and forest collaboratives, and as we're training mitigation specialists now, it's going to an HOA meeting and talking to folks at the HOA meeting. It's not simply going to the county fair and giving them a brochure as they walk by that says, you should do something, because what happens to the brochure? You know, you might hand out 500 brochures, and if you go to the closest circular receptacle, 480 of them ended up there. In the past, though, people used that they gave out the brochure as the metrics or the metric of that they've interacted with people. That's not interaction. So it's really more, how do we talk to people? How do we get people in an audience where we can discuss it, walk their property with them? But that's labor intensive. You know, we do a lot of pre-fire mitigation with our crews and with contractors. Our foresters may walk an individual property owner's property half a dozen times before the first chainsaw goes zing. You're out there the first time talking to them about the issues, about what they want. Then you're out there again, you're talking to them about, okay, this is what I think I'm going to recommend. Does that meet your needs? Then you do a prescription, you review that with them, you go back out and meet potential contractors, then you contract it, then you get the work done. So it's high labor intensity to get that done. The bullseye around the house was accompanied by a PSA to help citizens. And like I said, it was actually included in their property tax bills. I think almost everyone opens their property tax bill. You can include stuff like that in things that people don't necessarily open. And I think of like water utility bills. A lot of people have their water utilities set up to auto pay. They don't open a bill anymore. But if you own real estate, you open your property tax bill every year. It's still one piece of mail we get, and we actually all open consistently. I got the 2-minute warning from Dave, so I think I'm about up, but I'm going to be hopping between the breakout rooms later, and I really do look forward to continuing a conversation about this.
Carol, this is great. We do have I really appreciate your insights and everything. And yeah, I was thinking, well, I don't know, maybe that Ed McMahon letter I might open every once in a while, but I just never seem to win that one. You know, we do have a question in the chat that I did want to ask from Brian, or Brian, you know, if you'd like to ask it, you know, please go right ahead.
Oh, no, I think Carol had addressed that. So thank you, Carol.
Okay, great.
And there is a question about, you know, students. And I will say that, you know, doing education with students helps. But again, you know, that's not the silver bullet. It may or may not get translated to parents. I think younger kids, this talks about high school students. I actually think younger kids are better ambassadors for going home and talking about what they learned in school that day. So if we can talk to little kids, we do a program with first and second graders on evacuation planning in our neighborhoods, because they go home and tell mom what they learned in school. A high school kid may or may not even be home for dinner, much less talk about what they learned in school. So they might carry it with them in the future, but they might not be translating it in real time.
You know, that's interesting. You know, what you said really hit me, being a meteorologist, is that, you know, after the first 6 months, people are really sensitive about the wildfire moving through, and then 6 months to a year, they're kind of drifting off. After a year, they're like, we're not thinking about this anymore. And then we already had the wildfire. Well, it's the same thing with storms and hurricanes, right? People, after they get hit by a hurricane, say, oh, okay, we had my hurricane in my lifetime, so now we're done. You know, we're not going to get impacted by that anymore. So I think folks like NOAA, the National Weather Service, have really hired more social scientists to understand how the public thinks and how they process certain language. And I'm just wondering, your work with Sarah, have you looked at all into how the public responds to certain terminology, or who they trust to get their information from?
I think they trust the Weather Service, but the Weather Service's messaging is sometimes confusing. What's the difference between a watch and a warning and an advisory? And so that can be presenting a problem to folks. At least now, I think in our state, people like red flag warning. People are getting red flag warning. They're starting to understand that at the citizen level. Like, okay, there's a high chance for a big wind to make a fire really bad today. But a lot of the flood warnings and all, which we would deal with on the post-fire flooding, not so much on hurricanes, but you know, they're still confused about what's what, and should they be leaving, and where would they go, and that kind of thing.
We have a question. We have a question from Brian here, just wondering if you've come across any misinformation that people are spreading about wildfires.
So not so
Or
much
hazards.
the pre-fire. In the post-fire world, I frequently come across, we tell people right after a fire, we look at everybody in drainages and say, go get flood insurance. And then they'll say, oh, well, you know, their insurance agent told them they had to get landslide insurance. And it's like, no, flood insurance carries all the mud and the debris that carries with the flood in a post-fire flood. It's not a landslide. But I get that one at least once on every single fire over 20 plus years. And at this point in time, I've worked intimately on over 25 fires. So it shocks me that I still come up with, oh no, my insurance agent said I need landslide insurance.
Well, this is great, and we have other questions in the chat. I do want to keep this moving forward, and Carol's going to be with us for the whole session. She's going to participate, maybe jumping in and out of the breakout sessions, and we're going to have more opportunities at the end for questions. So please keep them coming. What I'd like to do now is I would like to go to the clusters. We're going to go in this order, cluster speakers, just so you know. We're going to start with the agricultural and climate cluster. So Brian Wee will kick it off, and then we'll go to the air quality cluster, Enviro sensing cluster with Scotty, then the data readiness cluster, and then we'll move on finally to hear about the information quality cluster and Bob Downs. Each cluster has about 4 minutes to just describe what it is they do. It's not so we can just absorb and understand everything. It's to really start us to think about how we might start to work across cluster activities. So each one of the cluster members is going to share their screen and show the PowerPoint. All of the PowerPoints are available on the Ecip session location within Sched, and you can feel free to get them and download them yourself. So we'll start off with Brian Wee and the Ag and Climate Cluster. Brian, thanks a lot. I appreciate your participating and your volunteering to present today.
Dave and company and Karen, thanks for inviting the Ag and Climate Cluster. I'm going to initiate sharing my screen right now. This is the one. and I will make it larger in presentation mode. Whoa. Oh, gosh. Sorry, folks.
There we go.
Press the wrong button. All right, sorry. So my clock has started in 4 minutes, and I will go through this in chronological order to recount what the ACC, the Agriculture and Climate Cluster, has done circa 2020 to present. So in this slide here in 2020, we experimented with pre-fire mitigation planning, as it so turns out, focus on Colorado. And what we tried to do there was to use concept maps to link policy up here. For example, this policy was related to then Colorado Governor Hickenlooper forming a task force and recommending that this thing called the Colorado Wildfire Risk Assessment web portal be used for community planning. And so this, what we tried to do with this concept map was to link policy all the way and trace that policy down to how communities could use these resources to create something called the CWPP, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan, and how these CWPPs are eventually linked to national legislation like the the Forest Restoration Act of 2003. Now, of interest to us, of course, in ESIP is eventually this linkage that goes from a portal to a data product like Landfire data that actually ingests NASA data from Landsat. And so more details can be seen here. Now, what's not on the screen here is that the concept map experiment eventually evolved into knowledge maps, which we implemented in a knowledge graph database called Neo4j. It is not shown here, but it will be shown in the 2 screens down. Now that's 2020. In 2021, which was last year, we kind of graduated to looking at how data is transformed into information, into management decisions, as you can see here vertically, but also how can that data information be used and reused, not only within a wildfire management phase like pre-fire mitigation planning, but across phases. Now, the thesis behind that, of course, is that any data that you generate for pre-fire mitigation planning, say a risk assessment or hazards and vulnerability assessment, should be made available not only for pre-fire mitigation planning, but that information could also be useful during fire when you have to actively react to an ongoing situation. Do not lose that information and data that you generated during quote unquote peacetime. And so it was during the 2021 when we invited Dave Zader from Boulder to help us figure some of these requirements out. And you might have heard Susan Shingle-Decker mention about Dave Zader in that roundtable exercise earlier today. So that's the same Dave Zader from Boulder. Now, come to this year, 2022, we have continued this framework of enabling data information interoperability across wildfire management phases. As you can see here from the bottom, we're still focused on pre-fire and the during fire phases. But in this case, we brought in Chief Dave Winokur and the Moore Foundation's Jenny Biggs to help us from the stakeholder and figure out what are some of the functional requirements and how do we convert the functional requirements into physical implementations. And for this part of the diagram where my cursor is hovering over, we invited Scotty Strachan, who's on this call also from Enviro Sensing. We invited the drones cluster to speak to us too. And so my time is nearly up. What I will do is I will leave in the link in the chat window the 3 takeaways from the presentation yesterday, as well as a big visual overview of what happened yesterday and how the clusters, including information quality and data quality, how these different clusters fit into the overall context of what we discussed yesterday. And I should stop presenting here. Thanks, Dave. Back to you.
Great, thank you, Brian. We're going to stop sharing the screen there, and I'll go into the. Let's see. Let me continue here and go over to this one. So I appreciate that, Brian. We're going to move now on to the air quality cluster and Steve Young. Steve, are you prepared to share your screen? And we'll have 4 minutes. Megan is sort of helping me with timekeeping, so she'll let us know when the 4 minutes.
I'm going to turn
is
my
up.
camera on when you have about 30 seconds left. And Steve, thanks for sharing twice.
Yeah, I didn't anticipate that Dave was going to hop back in for a second.
Sorry.
So no worries. So hi, I'm Steve Young, and I am stepping in as a co-chair of the air quality cluster. What the air quality cluster does is kind of self-explanatory, I think. So, rather than go into that, I will just say these are some personal ideas, pretty much, not necessarily representing the cluster as a whole, in fairness. So at the idea front, what do communities need? Thinking pre-fire, we're going to focus on smoke for fairly obvious reasons if we're talking air quality here. And I'm going to try not to read all this stuff. The presentation will be available, but helping communities, guiding them to available relevant information resources so that they have access to that information up front is going to be important. And I will suggest having deployable resources available, kind of planning for this and having them available, ready to go, could be very important. And, the focus for us at air quality, do you need additional mobile air quality sensors that you could get out into the field? Do you want to have inventories of air purifiers and potentially other protective equipment for the most vulnerable populations of people with asthma, for example? The chief made a really good point yesterday. He said that for fire response, real-time data isn't necessarily that useful because they're on more of a 24-hour cycle. He said, I will suggest that when we're talking about smoke and sensitive populations, near real-time data are actually pretty important. And also if there's for example, a sudden wind shift, if you've got a fire crew out there and the wind suddenly shifts, you'd like to have as much advance notice that wind shift is about to hit as you can get, because you might have to get that crew out of there on extremely short notice. So wanted to make that point. Now, a couple of examples of what's happening out there. Purple Air is a really interesting, kind of community science, hyper-local initiative where you can get a low-cost air quality sensor, put it up, it connects to internet, similar to WeatherBug for weather data. So that's a really interesting resource that has shown up a lot with the recent wildfires, because you could see those elevated levels. There they are. They're showing up on people's sensors. Similarly, NOAA has a really interesting smoke forecasting tool. And I'll tell you, during last year's fire season, you could see on that we were getting poor air quality all the way out on the East Coast. Transporting across the country from the West Coast fires. So these smoke forecasting tools are potentially very important, and being positioned to take advantage of them. Now, just a little bit on some thoughts about deployable sensors. And a lot of this is probably going to, interrelate to what Scotty's about to talk about. So I won't really dwell on the fine points here, but I will mention that dual use could be very important. That if you have sensors that not only allow you to measure air quality on a real-time or near real-time basis, but also the meteorological data, so that you might pick up an unexpected shift in wind direction, wind speed from a dual use deployable sensor that happens to have been strategically positioned. So I think, the points are probably pretty obvious. And again, Scotty will probably, touch on similar stuff from a much better informed point. So again, could you pre-stage, have ready to deploy some of these assets, as something to think about. So lightning talk, I think I will stop there, and I look forward to the next round of the talks. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'm going to jump. I don't have to show the PowerPoint slide again. We can jump right into Scotty with Enviro Sensing. Steve, you gave me got some questions in my mind. We'll continue to move through this and get to them at the end. Thanks so much. Scotty?
There we go. Okay. Hopefully you can hear me.
Hear you just fine.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Dave and company. So yeah, I'm Scotty Strachan. I'm representing the Enviro Sensing cluster. This cluster has been around for nearly a decade in Ecip. And this is really a collection of experts from, you could say, grassroots science-based observations and in situ observations. And so this cluster is made up of people from the CZO, NEON, USGS, LTER, NOAA, NASA, EPA. There's a whole bunch of people involved in this cluster that have spent an awful lot of time deploying, again, science-based in situ observations. And so we feel like even though we were coming from more scientific missions for hydrology, ecology, climate, et cetera, perspective, there's a lot of value, and Steve alluded to this, when you start to make your deployments multi-mission. So we feel like that's a contribution that our cluster can start to make to the wildfire community. So when we talk about, what are some of the science-based things that this community does, and which ones are appropriate for wildfire or fire prep, detection, response, and mitigation. We can talk about the classic remote automated weather system installations and things like fuel and soil moisture, plant greenness in the understory where you can't get to it with remote sensing and things like that. But more importantly, our cluster has really been digging into these issues, not around the wildfire topic, but just data sharing and trusted data in general, about what are the common software and cyber infrastructure needs to really make data more useful more quickly across these grassroots, again, networks and organizations. We also recognize that the next step in sort of cutting edge, expanding a point measurement to a watershed scale measurement is integration with UAS-borne sensors and things like that. And we feel like there's a lot of potential for evaluating, let's say, fine scale fuel and soil moisture characteristics using UAS. So I think there's a lot of potential there. The bottom line for our group also is that networking your sensors is really important, and data networks are going to be the key to this whole business of both gathering the data and sharing the data appropriately. So we also feel that there's a training and management gap for implementing sensors and networks at community scale. And this has to do with the fact that this stuff is kind of complex. And if you want it to be reliable and trusted over a long period of time, there's best practices that have to be applied. And our group in its early days spent a lot of time on publishing the best practices for sensor networks. So to conclude this flash presentation, I want to give the rest of this community an idea of, okay, so when we say science-based, where are the scientists coming from? Why are we deploying these sensor networks? Well, it's not to protect homes and businesses and this sort of thing. I will say that a lot of these networks have come and these practices have come out of the need to study things like hydrology, emissions, ecology, and fire process. If you say, what are the wildland fire science components? And then, those are overlaying on this concept of a fire continuum. Fire is either happening right now or it will happen again soon. And I think this was alluded to earlier by our guest speaker. And this is definitely true for most of the Western United States. The key to merging this fire continuum and the science is data-driven cyber infrastructure innovations. And so with that, that's just the flash presentation. Thanks again, Dave, for letting us come in here and engage.
Scotty, this is great. Really appreciate that. And Brian made the point too that you made these points yesterday and in the Ag and Climate Cluster workshop. And I think it's really, incumbent upon us within ESIP to say, okay, let's take what's being presented here and boil this down into some actionable steps that we might be able to take to make some big impacts. Scotty, thanks so much. I'd like to introduce now Douglas Rao, Yuhan, who is going to talk about the data readiness cluster. Douglas, it's all yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. So I'm here presenting on behalf of the data readiness cluster within Ecip, and with my co-chair, Tyler Christensen, who is in this session as well. And with data readiness cluster, we are not focusing on specific use case, one specific use case, but we're looking at how we can focus on the readiness for the AI applications. So AI has been a power tool for many of the earth science applications and use cases. Like in yesterday's workshop, that AI machine learning has been mentioned several times as well. So the focus of the current data readiness cluster is to how we can define a data AI readiness level and standards that to allow the users find the data that easy to use in the AI and machine learning applications, and how the data providers can assess and improve the general usability of the data. So in order to achieve that, we are working on several things. The first thing is to define what AI readiness really mean for the open environmental data. And we want to specifically focus on the community-defined user requirements through a survey that's currently ongoing, and identifying what's the tools needed to assess the readiness of the environmental and earth science data that for different use cases, and what's the way to represent the readiness level to allow the easy discovery and access of the data. So ideally, we want to publish a formal data standards on AI readiness of the data. So we, as I mentioned, we are currently engaging with the AI machine learning practitioners to define the user requirement for AI ready data. And so there are a lot of data, such as the HRRR data that Steve mentioned from NOAA, that provides the wildfire potentials. So how we can engage with the wildfire stakeholders to identify those requirements. And for the AI ready data that we have four focus, one is on the data preparation, data quality, and data documentation and access. So we produce a draft data readiness, AI readiness data checklist for everyone to look at and provide comments. So you can go to the link on the slides, and there are more information you can find for each characteristics within each category of the data readiness for AI applications. So since it's a cross-cluster collaboration, I just want to use this timeline of our effort on AI-ready data to provide some brainstorming ideas that we can work together. So right now we want moving from the AI-ready data survey that to a user focus group to identify the key factors for AI-ready data. And with that user group outcomes, we'll draft the community standards and to develop pilot readiness assessments with different data providers like NOAA, NASA, USGS, and UK Met Office. And the last step in the next 2 years would be use case driven AI ready data collections to coming back to the wildfire applications. And with AI can be a powerful tool in this application. So we really want to have the engagement with wildfire stakeholders, in this case, to our user focus group to look at what's the AI ready data means for the wildfire applications and what's the key challenges. And what we will also want to do a pilot assessment with those high priority data sets for the wildfire applications, no matter whether it's pre-wildfire, during or post-wildfire. And we can also doing some code development for a collection of the AI ready data to empower the AI application development for wildfires. And some potential future activity can be a hackathon or sprint to focus on develop AI applications for wildfire that will require the preparation for AI ready data and also engagement with both developers, domain experts, and communities on this topic. Without turning back to Dave.
Douglas, thanks so much. That's great. It's really interesting. The more we hear about AI and how we heard from Jensen's son yesterday about the issues with AI and what you really have to consider, really leads me to some questions. Hopefully, we can talk about more as we, I think what we'll be doing is inviting your clusters to come in and meet with the disaster lifecycle cluster so we can figure out ways forward. This is great. Thanks, Douglas. We're going to go to our final cluster presentation from Bob Downs with the information quality cluster. Bob, are you all ready to go?
I think so. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can see it just fine. Just
Oh,
needs to
great.
go into, there you go.
Oh, fantastic. So yes, I'm representing the information quality cluster, and my the leadership team of the information quality cluster, I believe, is with us today. Rama, Pang, Yaksing, and David. And we're going to talk about prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery. And so a lot of information is needed during the various stages to deal with wildfires. For instance, when we're thinking about prevention, we want to be aware of the combustibles and get any information we can on that. Likewise, for when we're preparing, we want to see what populations are in the area and the locations of those populations, as well as travel time, for example, to the nearest medical facilities and location of firefighting resources, et cetera. Likewise, when we're responding to the fire, we need data and information about population estimates and travel time and their locations as well, but also looking at things like being able to get the volume of water and, as Carol had mentioned, wind speed, et cetera. And then for recovery, we certainly want to know the availability of labor that can help with the repairs and restoration, as well as cost estimates for recovery and information from the insurance companies, et cetera. And I have here a shot from the Cdec hazards mapper from the Marshall fire in the Denver area that Carol had talked about. The important thing here, though, is that we have accurate, timely, accessible, reliable, easy to use information so that we can have that information when we are planning, and particularly during the pre-wildfire challenge. Looking at the aspects of information quality throughout the data set life cycle, we can think about the science quality, that is when the science team is developing the data and they're looking at accuracy, precision, and certainty, et cetera. But also product quality when we're preparing these products for dissemination for use. We certainly want to have the quality documentation in there and the metadata, et cetera, so that they can be useful to the potential users and actual users. And then for stewardship quality, we want to know if those data are being managed and preserved. If we are using them today, will they be there tomorrow, for example? And then in terms of service quality, how easy is it for the users to actually discover and get the data? So the users need to know about the quality of the data sets that they plan to use, especially critical is the data and information used for preventing, preparing, and responding and recovering to wildfires and other disasters. And the required information element should pay attention to and be judged by these aspects of information quality. Finally, I just want to say thank you very much for this opportunity, Dave and Karen and John. And also, we have a session later on today for those who might be interested in attending at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you very much.
Bob, thanks so much. That was terrific. I'm just going to turn my camera back on, and I'm doing a little bit of conversation behind the scenes here to pull a little audible. What we're going to do is ask Dr. David Green to come up and go next, because we want to make sure we have enough quality time with David. And we ask everybody, whoops. We ask everybody to stick around for the breakout sessions after David is done, and then we'll adjust the time for the breakout session depending on how much time we have. So with that said, David, I would like to invite you to start. David is the new Wildfire Program Manager for NASA headquarters in the Applied Sciences Division. David?
Okay. Thank you. Let me pull up my talk. Just a few slides. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you
Yes.
fine, David. Mhm.
And can you see my screen?
Not
No.
yet.
Yeah.
No. Okay, let me check again. Oh, I know what I did wrong. Here we go. That should work. And screen share, how's that?
Yes.
Great.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for the opportunity once again to join with some of my friends and colleagues in the ESIP family, some people I haven't seen for quite a while and people that we see on a regular basis.
I see it just fine. Yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to talk for a few minutes at the invitation about NASA with ESIP. And I also wanted to put a little tweak on the name of ESIP, where the S could also mean system. Because as you've seen in a lot of our discussions, wildfire is requiring us to bring together many disciplines, many types of data, many types of practices, tactical, strategic, operational, local, tribal, and areas of different scale and different times. And so therefore, working with ESIP, it's this idea of developing the collaboratory, the collaboration. And I'm going to emphasize that today and re-articulate a few things that have been discussed both today, this morning, and yesterday's session. One of the things that we have had at NASA when I was leading the disasters program over the last few years was this idea that we can bring geospatial information to get an understanding of the risk potential before anything even happens. And when things do happen, that risk is not just the hazard itself of the fire, but it's its proximity to communities, population centers, farms, and economies, to the air, and in particular, those who are sensitive to changes in the air, the land, and the water. We put our information together in these collective communities because we wanted a platform, and we chose one that was open in our sense, that we could actually show the combinations of information of loss and impact, and even invite others with other data types, population, census, loss, health, to bring their information together. And that is more of what we're seeing is needed, but explicitly the platforms to do it and to judge the value and the quality of using it for decisions. Now, what's going on in NASA right now, and I will say also many of the other federal agencies, is that almost every organization is going to be receiving new funds, new authorities to partner, to bring together, to build collaboratories. NASA is one of them. NASA has across Earth science, areas of research, data. Thank you for acknowledging us as a trusted source, among others. We have airborne assets and satellites. We have water systems, partnership programs, mapping, visualization, and processing. But in recent years, while we had talked about Earth systems decades ago, we had become siloed ourselves, silos or circles here of excellence. But with wildfires, what's going to be different is the programs, the projects, technology, research, applications aeronautics, all hands on deck and all programs will be working with each other, co-funding. And this means the transition to applications, to partnerships, to challenge grants and SBIRs for commercialization, to bridge funds to other organizations, whether it's NSF or Forest Service. I just met with the Red Cross, and we've met with many humanitarian sectors and partners, both domestically, regionally, and internationally. So what I want to emphasize is us working together with some of the clusters. And even this definition of community, I had a discussion with leaders in the UK this morning about that we don't really have an effective definition of community, but it must be one that cannot be standardized. Like many of our data cannot be standardized. Because what we need are frameworks and harmonization that recognizes that there are many different types of communities and different types that are created and need to be created. So one of the things we can do together is create and build the buy-in across all levels of community to co-develop our tools and our practices. I've had many calls, and I've met with universities and consortia over the last few weeks, calling for us to come together on pilots that show that we can collaborate. And when that is proven, or perhaps disproven, demonstrate the value together of what that Earth system and these frameworks and these geographical and timely ways of working can indeed be effective. Make sure that we can, in fact, create a positive message about where things are effective, where things can be improved, and in particular, can be sustained and maintained. We heard that yesterday, strongly emphasized. It's not good enough in our science discipline, for example, to just publish a paper and go to a conference. When you're dealing with impact, you want that maintenance and sustained approach. You also can't do everything everywhere. And I would argue that our science, our technology, and our partnerships are mature enough to look at wildfire management, not the wildfires just on their own. And by the way, Dave, not just awareness, but the idea that our awareness must lead to action. So these are user-driven, diverse and inclusive of approach. And I'll also contrast with some of the just previous discussions, which are very complementary. We often talk about need and we immediately go to solutions. And I would suggest that what we can do in NASA and ESIP together is identify what are the actual questions that people need to answer to prioritize action, and then look in our toolbox to see if our tools can be worked together, because no one tool is effective alone. And look at this idea of the pre-fire, active fire, and post-fire. But I'll remind everyone that even in the pre-fire, we must be looking ahead. If we do effective pre-fire, how will that play out in the active regime? If we do effective pre-fire and anticipatory work, how will that play out in post-fire? To, if nothing else, lessen the surprises that we seem to somehow keep finding. So the application of our science, our tools, and our partnerships for society, recognizing that wildfires are part of cascading types of information that we need to share. And again, something that we can do with ESIP through these pilots, through demonstrations, through test and evaluation of what is actually effective sharing, effective information networks. The discussion in the previous about the observing networks. The technology side, I can tell you in this wildfire, will be about building sensor webs and more autonomy, because there is so many of these networks now that are beyond us manually turning things on and off, and similarly visualizing them in new and effective ways. We have to assemble and fuse a lot of different types of data, economic data, social and cultural data. One of the things I think we can do together is I am co-leading with the National Institutes of Health, the Environmental Institute, the NIEHS, along with EPA and NOAA and all the other agencies. What can we do to actually fuse our data together? And I think it would be great to have, as Dave was describing, ESIP and the clusters take a look at what is integrated, bring that out to some users, and the thing that we miss so much, feedback. Are we identifying all the data that needs to come together to answer those questions? Then can we work on getting it together? And please, is it really answering the questions for action? So by way of engaging with stakeholders, our new program is reaching out across communities to have our first of what will turn out to be very many different kind of stakeholder engagements. And you're going to hear in this meeting that's coming up on the 3rd and 4th, an opportunity to frame it as I was just discussing. We're going to ask key members of the communities, not what they need, but what questions do they have? And if they had answers to those questions, what are the 1 or 2 key questions that if they could make progress on answering those together, would make a significant ability to overcome some of the barriers? Because I know many of you have looked at the challenge documents about wildfires, and frankly, we're saying the same thing now that we said in 2010 and 2000 and years ago. We keep repeating the same needs and wants. We have to change the paradigm. I think our partnerships in ESIP, helping us bring together the public, the private, the philanthropic, the civil society groups, the industry sectors, they're all doing things right now. It's incredible. There's an incredible amount. We don't need more data or more drones or more maps and models, but we're not bringing it together. As many people said, is at the end of the pipeline, it needs to be clear and understood. And no one really cares, arguably, where it came from. But we're not bringing it together. And I think that's what we can do with ESIP and others, where there are gaps, where there are voids. We have programs and partners who we can turn to help close them, including some of the resources we'll have. So one of the things we want to do is advance a proactive approach rather than purely a defensive approach. Promote the information collection together, which ESIP is good at, but evaluate strategic, tactical, and operational. I would argue that there's been a lot of communities that immediately race to the tactical. But the pre-event and the planning and a lot of the resources can also go into strategic, and I think we need that distinction. Exploring the integration, as we're doing in our program. We're not the lead agency to fight fires. We're not the lead agency to do the mitigation, but we're looking at perhaps our role at NASA to be enabling that integration, the science, the technology, and the knowledge. We can do that with ESIP. One of the things we could use help with and work together on is deciding how do we capture those lessons learned. And as I said, get the validation with the community and get the feedback on what practices are effective. We can strengthen this collaboration together by recognizing that one of the ways to do this is to, and it's been discussed this week, is we know how some of these scenarios may play out. I think we could do some pilots and efforts that really talk about these kind of complex cascading scenarios. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'd like to hear back from those or suggest taking that into the breakout sessions as food for thought. But I just, to awareness that NASA is putting all hands on deck here. We're talking to many others. And the whole University of California system is coming together on this, all the schools. Red Cross is starting an effort called Mission Adaptation to be more proactive than reactive. And as you heard this morning, venture capitalists, philanthropies, and many communities, indigenous, local, diversity schools are also doing this. But I think it would be a loss of a window of opportunity if we didn't look at the fact that there is a recognition now that this is a priority. We can do business differently, and the money is out there and on the table right now to do that. But we've got about 3 or 4 years now to really establish a new roadmap. And I think one of the other things that we could do, and Karen, thank you for saying, not just the next 6 months, but let's get a few discrete milestones on the ESIP NASA roadmap together for perhaps the next 6 months and a few markers beyond that. So thank you.
David, this is great. Thanks so much. And just to let everyone else who's in the session know, we're going to forego the breakouts, but it doesn't mean that that stops your participation, because this is going to continue in our monthly meetings for the Disaster Lifecycle Cluster. So it's really important that you join us in those meetings. It's every first Thursday of the month at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're going to continue these conversations, but we still have time. We have a few minutes left in this session, which has a hard stop at 3 o'clock, kind of like hitting a network satellite window, where I want to entertain some questions that anyone has. So if you have any questions based on what Carol was saying, or what any of the clusters were saying, or also David and his vision. And while they're coming together, David, I just have a quick question for you, and that is your main focus, and I don't know if this is really geared towards the applied sciences wildfire focus or across all of NASA, is the focus for the next several years to build this roadmap to impact people and communities, or to advance technologies for states and other federal agencies to use, or maybe yes to everything? I'm not sure.
Yeah, so I was going to say the answer is yes. We're kind of calling our collective effort Wildfire Sense, kind of making sense. And one of the first things out of the gate this year will be Fire Tech, which is really putting some resources and partnerships there around these technical networks and sensors. But in partnership with that, it will be for application and to feed research. There'll be resources in the research team, both for atmospheric chemistry and composition and smoke and plumes, as well as the vegetative cover, both the canopy and on the ground. There will be flight and missions, our new satellites. A lot of people keep going back to Landsat and MODIS. I'll let you know, we've got 20 different satellites. Most of them do something for wildfire. We've got airborne assets. And for the first time, we're going to be really partnering with the aeronautics part of NASA. And their commitment is to help coordinate an integrated airspace, where we'll be able to fly instruments, both planes and drones and anything else that can get up there. And then we will be working our grants programs with students and postdocs and academics to build the next generation. And as I said, there will be resources there for technology transfer and prizes and competitions. So we will be looking at partnerships with the insurance sectors, energy sector disruptions, lifeline disruptions, resilience building. But our role and our resources are sufficient to be enablers. And that's how we're going to position ourselves there. And that's why partnership is absolutely essential to our strategy. We have enough to make it interesting, to bring people together, just like the Federation, the part of ESIP and others. So that's our role. And that's why I think the alignment with ESIP is critical.
Well, this is great, David. I here's what I'd like to do. Since we're at time, we're gonna stop the session. We have questions and we have more conversation, but we are going into a coffee break, and we have a pretty cool technology where we can kind of gather together into a little corner of the room and continue to talk or ask questions. So I would encourage everybody, David, invite you to join us in the coffee break. We'll kind of wander around the room until we coalesce into a cell and start the conversation. But I really appreciate everybody's attention. We had a great number of participants. I know the chief from yesterday was on board with the session here today too. So I really appreciate that, Dave, for you being on board and being watching. We're going to follow up with you certainly, and also with David Green. But join us at the breakout session. Thank you all very much for joining today. And we'll just call it here for this particular session. And don't forget, please join us at the ESIP Disaster Lifecycle Cluster meetings every Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. So thanks very much.
First Thursday of the month, February 3rd next. Yeah.
Sorry, the first Thursday of every month. Sorry.
We have enough things to talk about to meet every Thursday, but just one a month these days.
One a month, the first Thursday.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your time. Have a great rest of the day.